The water was black. Not the blue black of a stormy sea, but the oily, suffocating black of death itself. July 30th, 1945, Philippine Sea. The USS Indianapolis had been under the surface for less than 15 minutes, and already the screams were fading into silence. Hundreds of men floated in their life jackets, scattered across miles of open ocean, watching the last bubbles rise from where their ship had been. Some were burned beyond recognition. Others bled from wounds they couldn't see in the darkness. And in that darkness, something was moving beneath them. If you've never imagined dying alone in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by the bodies of your friends, then you need to hear this story, because what happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The men didn't know it yet, but they were about to face 5 days and 4 nights of hell. No rescue boats were coming. No one even knew they were missing. The Navy had no record of their route, no schedule for their arrival. As far as the United States military was concerned, the Indianapolis was simply somewhere in the Pacific, doing its job. But the ship was gone, sunk by a Japanese submarine in 12 minutes. And now, nearly 900 men were floating in shark-infested waters, with nothing but their life jackets and each other. By the second day, the salt water would drive them mad. By the third, they would start drinking it. By the fourth, they would be killing each other, hallucinating, swimming down into the depths because they thought they saw land below. The sharks would take dozens, maybe hundreds. But the real killer wasn't the sharks. It was something far worse. Something that lives inside the human mind when hope dies. The ocean doesn't just take your body. It takes your sanity first, piece by piece, memory by memory, until you're no longer sure who you are or why you're fighting to survive. But what happened before that scene? What brought these men to this cursed patch of ocean in the first place? The USS Indianapolis was not just any ship. She was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, a warrior of the Pacific Campaign, decorated and battle-tested. She had survived kamikaze attacks, bombardments, and the brutal island-hopping campaign that defined the war in the Pacific. Her crew was experienced, disciplined, and proud. But just 10 days before her sinking, the Indianapolis had completed the most secret mission of World War II. In her hull, sealed in a large crate under armed guard, she had carried components of Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The mission was so classified that even the ship's captain, Charles Butler McVeigh III, didn't know exactly what he was transporting. He only knew it was vital, urgent, and that failure was not an option. The cargo was guarded around the clock by military police, who had orders to shoot anyone who approached without authorization. The crew whispered rumors, some believing they were carrying gold, others thinking it was a new type of weapon. None of them imagined they were transporting the instrument that would end the war and usher in the atomic age. The Indianapolis delivered her cargo to Tinian Island on July 26, 1945. The mission was a success. The components were unloaded and would soon be assembled into the bomb that would change human history forever. But success in war often carries a price, and this ship's payment was already being calculated in the dark waters ahead. After Tinian, the Indianapolis was ordered to Guam for a brief stop, then onward to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, where she would join other ships and prepare for the planned invasion of Japan. No escort ships were assigned. The route was considered relatively safe. Naval intelligence reported minimal Japanese submarine activity in the area. Captain McVeigh requested an escort anyway, but his request was denied. The Navy told him it wasn't necessary. They told him the waters were secure. They were catastrophically wrong. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, captain of the Japanese submarine I-58, had been patrolling the Philippine Sea for weeks with little success. Japan was losing the war, and submarine commanders were under immense pressure to score victories against American ships. On the night of July 29th, Hashimoto surfaced his submarine to recharge batteries and spotted a dark shape on the horizon. At first, he thought it might be a tanker or a destroyer. As the shape grew closer, he realized it was something far more valuable, a heavy cruiser, sailing alone, unescorted, moving at a steady speed without zigzagging. Hashimoto couldn't believe his luck. He positioned his submarine for an attack, calculating the cruiser's speed and trajectory. At precisely 12:14 a.m. on July 30th, 1945, he gave the order to fire. 6 torpedoes launched from the I-58. 2 of them found their target. The first torpedo struck the Indianapolis on her starboard bow, obliterating the forward section of the ship. The explosion was so violent that men sleeping in the forward compartments were killed instantly, their bodies vaporized or crushed by the collapsing steel. The second torpedo hit near the fuel tanks and ammunition stores, triggering a massive secondary explosion that sent flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air. The blast was visible for miles. Captain McVeigh was thrown from his bed by the impact. He rushed to the bridge in his underwear, trying to assess the damage, trying to understand what had just happened. But there was no time to understand. The ship was dying. All power was lost immediately. The radio room was destroyed in the blast, which meant no distress signal could be sent. The ship's communication with the outside world was severed in an instant. The Indianapolis was alone, mortally wounded, and no one knew. In the chaos and darkness, men scrambled for the deck, but the ship was listing so severely to starboard that many couldn't reach the ladders. The passageways were filling with water. Fires raged in multiple sections. Men were trapped below, sealed in by twisted metal and rising water, pounding on hatches that would never open, screaming names that would never be answered. On deck, sailors tried to launch lifeboats, but the list was too extreme. Some boats couldn't be freed from their davits. Others launched only to be crushed against the side of the sinking ship. 12 minutes after the torpedoes hit, the USS Indianapolis rolled over and sank stern first into the Philippine Sea, her propellers still turning as she disappeared beneath the surface. Approximately 300 men went down with her, trapped in the hull, or pulled under by the suction of the sinking ship. The rest, around 880 sailors and Marines, found themselves floating in the dark, calling out for their shipmates, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to survive. Survivor Edgar Harrell, a Marine corporal who had been sleeping on deck when the torpedoes hit, later described that first night as eerily quiet after the initial panic. The screaming had stopped. The fires had been swallowed by the ocean. In the darkness, men formed groups, trying to stay together, calling out to find friends and officers. Some had life jackets, others clung to floating debris, wooden planks, cargo nets, anything that would keep them above water. The moon was hidden behind clouds. The water was warm, almost bath-like, which seemed like a mercy at first. But as the sun rose on July 30th, that warmth would become a curse. The first day brought unbearable heat. The tropical sun rose quickly, turning the ocean into a vast reflective mirror that magnified the light and heat. Men with burns screamed in agony as the salt water seared their wounds. There was no fresh water, no food, no shade. Some men had managed to reach small inflatable rafts, but most floated freely, their legs dangling in the water like bait. The life jackets, made of kapok, were only designed to keep a man afloat for 48 hours before becoming waterlogged. After that, men would have to struggle just to keep their heads above the surface. Officers tried to organize the groups to keep morale up, to maintain military discipline even in the midst of catastrophe. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, took charge of the largest group, nearly 400 men clustered together. He ordered them to stay close, to link arms, to sing songs and recite prayers. Anything to keep their minds focused, to prevent them from drifting away into isolation and despair. And that's when the sharks arrived. Do you believe a human being can survive 4 days in open water, watching their friends torn apart by sharks, slowly losing their mind to dehydration and hallucinations? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because what these men endured defies every limit of human endurance and sanity. The oceanic white-tip sharks came in the hundreds, drawn by the blood, the splashing, the vibrations of distress. These sharks are known among sailors as particularly aggressive, opportunistic predators that patrol the open ocean looking for exactly this kind of situation. They circled the groups of men, sometimes for hours, bumping against legs and torsos, testing, waiting. Survivors reported that the attacks often came at dusk and dawn, when the sharks were most active. A man would be there one moment, talking, praying, holding onto his friend's hand, and then he'd be pulled under with barely a scream, leaving only a spreading pool of red. Edgar Harrell recalled seeing a friend literally bitten in half, the water turning crimson, the man's eyes locking with his for one final impossible second before he disappeared. The screams from shark attacks echoed across the water, a sound that would haunt the survivors for decades. Some men tried to fight back, punching and kicking at the sharks. Others simply froze, paralyzed by terror. Lieutenant Commander Haynes tried to keep his group calm, telling them to stay still, to avoid splashing, to kick gently rather than thrashing. But fear is contagious, and when one man panicked, the sharks came for him. But the sharks, as horrifying as they were, weren't the worst of it. By the second day, men were drinking seawater. They knew they shouldn't. They'd been trained. Every sailor knew that drinking salt water would accelerate dehydration, that it would poison the body and mind. But the thirst was maddening, a fire in the throat that couldn't be reasoned with, a pain that overrode training and common sense. And once they started drinking, the hallucinations began. Men saw islands in the distance, lush and green, with fresh water and food waiting. They would break away from their groups and swim toward these phantom islands, calling back to their friends to follow them, swimming for hours until exhaustion took them under. They saw the Indianapolis, fully intact, just below the surface, her lights on, her crew waving at them to come aboard. They dove down to swim inside, never coming back up. They saw Japanese soldiers approaching in boats. They saw their mothers, their wives, their children calling to them from the water. Some men became convinced that there was fresh water at the bottom of the ocean, and they would remove their life jackets and dive down, convinced they would find relief below. Others began fighting each other over imaginary supplies, over hallucinated rafts loaded with food and water. Friends who had served together for years turned on each other, their minds broken by the sun and the salt and the impossible situation. Lieutenant Commander Haynes watched his group of 400 shrink day by day, hour by hour. He tried desperately to maintain order, to keep the men singing, to prevent them from drinking seawater. But even his authority was crumbling. Men no longer listened to orders. Some simply drifted away, too exhausted to care. Every few hours, another man would slip quietly beneath the surface, too tired to fight anymore, his life jacket waterlogged, his body shutting down. The ocean was claiming them not through violence, but through the slow, patient arithmetic of exposure and despair. By day 3, entire groups had been wiped out. Men were scattered across more than 40 miles of ocean now, drifting with the current, separated from each other. Some had died from their injuries sustained in the sinking, others from dehydration, exposure, or the sharks. But many, perhaps most, died from something harder to quantify, something the survivors would later struggle to put into words. They died from the loss of hope. They died because they couldn't imagine being rescued, couldn't imagine that anyone even knew they were missing. And they were right to feel that way. Back at Naval Headquarters, no one had noticed that the Indianapolis was overdue. The ship had been scheduled to arrive at Lady Gulf, but when she didn't show up, no one raised an alarm. There was an assumption that she had been diverted, or delayed, or simply hadn't been properly logged. The Navy's communication systems were chaotic in the final months of the war, with thousands of ships moving across the Pacific. One missing cruiser didn't trigger any red flags. On the morning of August 2nd, a Navy pilot named Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was on routine anti-submarine patrol in a PV-1 Ventura bomber. His mission had nothing to do with searching for survivors. He was simply flying his assigned route when his antenna malfunctioned. He dropped altitude to fix the problem and happened to spot an oil slick on the surface of the ocean. Following the slick, he saw what he first thought were dead bodies. Dozens of them, floating face down in the water. But then one moved. Then another. Gwynn realized with shock that these men were alive. He immediately radioed for help, breaking protocol to broadcast on all frequencies, calling for any ship in the area to respond. He dropped survival gear from his plane, life rafts and supplies, circling above the men to let them know they had been seen. That help was coming. Within hours, rescue ships arrived. The USS Cecil J. Doyle, a destroyer escort, was the first to reach the survivors. Captain Clayton Granum ordered his ship's searchlight pointed straight up into the night sky as a beacon. even though it made his ship a target for any Japanese submarines in the area. He didn't care. There were men dying in the water, and he was going to save them. But for many, it was too late. Of the 880 men who survived the initial sinking, only 316 were pulled from the water alive. The rescue itself was traumatic. Men who had been semi-conscious for days suddenly found themselves being lifted onto ships, their skin peeling off in sheets, their lips cracked and bleeding, their minds shattered. Some didn't recognize their rescuers as real. They fought against being saved, believing it was another hallucination, another cruel trick their minds were playing on them. Edgar Harrell was so delirious that he attacked the sailors trying to help him, convinced they were enemy soldiers coming to finish him off. When he finally understood he was safe, that he was actually on a ship, that the nightmare was over, he collapsed and wept. Many survivors couldn't speak. Others couldn't stop speaking, babbling incoherently about sharks and islands and ships beneath the water. The medical crews aboard the rescue ships worked frantically to save as many as possible. But some men died on the deck, their bodies finally giving out just moments after being rescued. The Indianapolis disaster remains the worst loss of life at sea in United States Navy history. But the horror didn't end with the rescue. The Navy, embarrassed by the tragedy, and facing difficult questions about why the ship had been sailing alone, and why the rescue had taken so long, looked for someone to blame. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III became their scapegoat. In November 1945, he was court-martialed for hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, and for failing to order abandoned ship in a timely manner. It was an unprecedented and unjust decision. McVeigh had followed his orders exactly. He had requested an escort, which was denied. He had no intelligence about enemy submarines in the area. The Navy had given him routing information that was fatally flawed, and the order to zigzag was discretionary, to be used at the captain's judgment when visibility was good. That night, visibility had been poor. Moreover, naval experts testified that zigzagging would have made little difference against a submarine attack. The most damning evidence against the Navy's case came from an unexpected source. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine captain who had sunk the Indianapolis, was brought to testify at McVeigh's court-martial. He stated clearly that zigzagging would not have prevented him from hitting the Indianapolis. It was the only time in American military history that an enemy combatant was brought to testify against an American officer. Despite the testimony, and despite the vigorous defense by McVeigh's lawyers, the court found him guilty of failing to zigzag. He was not convicted of the abandoned ship charge. The verdict was controversial even within the Navy, and Admiral Chester Nimitz quietly remitted McVeigh's sentence. But the damage was done. For the rest of his life, Charles McVeigh received hate mail from the families of the dead, people who blamed him for the loss of their sons and husbands. Some letters were vicious, telling him he should have gone down with his ship, that he was a coward and a murderer. The survivors rallied to his defense. They wrote letters. They testified. They publicly declared that McVeigh was not responsible for what happened. Edgar Harrell and others spent decades fighting to clear their captain's name. But McVeigh carried the weight of those deaths every day. In 1968, at the age of 70, unable to bear the guilt and the accusations any longer, Charles Butler McVeigh III took his own life with his Navy service revolver on his front lawn. It wasn't until 2000, after decades of advocacy by survivors and their families, and after a remarkable campaign led by a young student named Hunter Scott, who researched the Indianapolis for a history project, that the United States Congress passed a resolution exonerating Captain McVeigh. President Bill Clinton signed it into law. The resolution stated clearly that McVeigh's court-martial was unjust, that he had performed his duties honorably, and that he was not responsible for the loss of the Indianapolis. Edgar Harrell, who lived until 2018, spent his final years telling the story, speaking at schools and veteran events, ensuring that the men of the Indianapolis would not be forgotten. He spoke of the friends he lost, of the terror and the hope, of the guilt that survivors carry. He spoke of Captain McVeigh with reverence and sorrow, angry that a good man had been destroyed by a Navy looking to cover its own failures. The survivors often spoke of the silence they found most haunting. Not the screams from the shark attacks, not the explosions when the ship went down, but the silence that came on the fourth day, when there were so few men left that their voices could no longer carry across the water. In that silence, each man was alone with his mortality, floating in an indifferent ocean, waiting for a rescue that seemed like it would never come. In that silence, the ocean revealed its true nature. Not cruel, not merciful, simply indifferent to human suffering. The USS Indianapolis was never forgotten by those who survived her. Every year, the remaining survivors gathered to remember the men who didn't make it home, to share their stories, to carry forward the memory of that terrible week in the Philippine Sea. They spoke of courage and cowardice, of brotherhood and madness, of the thin line between civilization and chaos. They spoke of 5 days that revealed everything about what human beings are capable of enduring and what they become when pushed beyond all limits. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. History isn't just about dates and battles and strategy. It's about the men and women who survived them, who carried the weight of those experiences for the rest of their lives, and the truth they brought home in their hearts. The USS Indianapolis and her crew deserve to be remembered not as a footnote in the history of World War II, but as a testament to human endurance, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of war.